Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Herbert Bix. Now it is a great honor for Binghampton University and a joy for me personally to welcome Noam Chomsky, who needs no introduction. Let us applaud him for all the work he has done for peace and justice over 45 years, and for bringing the light of reason to so many world issues. Thank you.
Thanks. Herb's timing was very good. It was exactly enough time for them to get me wired up. So you should be able to hear, I hope. The selection of issues that should rank high on the agenda of concern is naturally a subjective matter, but there are at least two that demand high priority because they are literally matters of survival. One of them is the threat of nuclear war, and the second is environmental disaster, both of which are very real. One of the many respected strategic analysts warning of the increasing threat of nuclear war is a former NATO planner, Michael McGuire. Writing in Britain's leading journal of international affairs, he warns that, I'll quote, under current U.S. policies, a nuclear exchange is ultimately inevitable, and unless these policies are sharply changed, we are virtually certain to see a return to nuclear arms racing involving intercontinental ballistic systems, space-based assets, reactivating the danger of inadvertent nuclear war with a probability that will be extremely high. Comparing the two crises that literally threaten survival, McGuire has this to say: by comparison with global warming, the cost of eliminating nuclear weapons would be small, but the catastrophic results of global nuclear war would greatly exceed those of progressive climate change because the effects would be instantaneous and could not be mitigated. The irony of the situation is that it is in our power to eliminate the threat of global nuclear war, but climate change cannot be evaded. Well, he's right on both counts. Means are available and are well known to eliminate the threat of instantaneous nuclear destruction. And while the timing of climate change can be debated, there's no escaping the fact, unless maybe you're in the White House, that the longer we delay in confronting it, the worse it's likely to be. Well, these considerations bring up a third crisis, namely the government of the world's leading power is increasing the likelihood of the two threats to survival. And it's important to stress government because the population does not agree, not very surprisingly. So just to take one example, the standard observation, which you all read, that the United States is almost alone in rejecting the Kyoto protocols is correct only if the phrase United States excludes its population, which strongly favors the Kyoto Pact. In fact, support is so strong that the majority of Bush voters believe that he too favors U.S. participation in the treaty because it's such an obvious thing to believe. More generally, this is just one illustration of the fact that voters were seriously deluded about the positions of the political parties in the last election. In fact, only 10% even knew what the stand was, 10% of voters. And that's not because of lack of interest or mental deficiency, but because elections are designed that way, purposely. Well, issues like these, and there are many of them, bring up a fourth crisis that should be of particular concern to us, and that is the very visible decline of functioning democracy. More generally, the ominous drift of the world's dominant power towards becoming a failed state. That's a fashionable term. It's conventionally applied to states that are regarded as enemies or portrayed as potential threats to our security or as needing our intervention to rescue the population, often by demolishing them in the process. A primary characteristic of failed states is their inability or unwillingness to protect their citizens from violence. They are, furthermore, what are sometimes called outlaw states, which regard themselves as beyond the reach of international law and norms of civilized behavior. And if they have democratic forms, they suffer from what's called a democratic deficit, which deprives the formal democratic institutions of any real substance. Well, it's not hard to recognize those characteristics painfully nearby. And more important, all of this is surely under our control if we're not content to observe passively and obediently. I'll return to some simple steps at the end. But the first step, transparently, is awareness and understanding. Without that, you can't proceed. So to begin with the most serious and imminent crisis, apart from specialist circles, very little attention is paid to the threat of nuclear war, and more importantly, to our own role in escalating the threat. Now, of course, we can't say that the threat is unknown. We've just passed the 50th anniversary of an appeal to the people of the world by Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein. Extraordinary appeal. They posed a choice that, in their words, is stark and dreadful and inescapable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? Well, war has certainly not been renounced in the last half century. Quite the contrary. By now, the world's hegemonic power accords itself officially the right to wage war at will under a doctrine of what's called anticipatory self-defense with unstated bounds. Well, as we all know, the doctrine is now being applied in Iraq and is being threatened in Iran. And the U.S. is backed in that stance by the spear carrier for the Pax Americana, and that's McGuire's term for Blair's Britain in the Journal of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. For the warrior and the spear carrier, international law, treaties, rules of world order are double-edged. They are sternly imposed on others with much self-righteous posturing, but they're dismissed as irrelevant for themselves. Now, throughout history, that stance has been familiar among states that have, or at least believe they have, unchallengeable power. The consequences are also well known, but historical analogies don't have much force because the stakes now are so much higher, literally survival of the species. McGuire is not alone. He's joined by many others, in fact, most specialists, in warning of the virtual inevitability of nuclear war. One of them is Kennedy Johnson, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, who recalled that the world, his words, came within a hair's breadth of nuclear disaster during the missile crisis of 1962, and goes on to say that that threat is once again severe. Quoting McNamara now, he warns of apocalypse soon unless there is a sharp change in current U.S. nuclear weapons policy, which is immoral, illegal, militarily unnecessary, and dreadfully dangerous, creating unacceptable risks to other nations and to our own, both the risk of accidental or inadvertent nuclear launch, which is unacceptably high and is terminal, and of nuclear attack by terrorists. He endorsed the judgment of Clinton's Defense Secretary, William Perry, that there's a greater than 50% probability of a nuclear strike on U.S. targets within a decade. That's referring to a dirty bomb, not the ultimate disaster. The threats are well understood, and they are being consciously enhanced. The Iraq invasion is only the most glaring example. Harvard University strategic analyst Graham Allison reports what he calls the consensus in the national security community, of which he's been a part, that a dirty bomb attack is inevitable, and an attack with a nuclear weapon, a terminal attack, highly likely if fissionable materials, which are the essential ingredient, are not retrieved, and if their further production is not terminated. I'll come back to the crucial question of controlling production. On retrieving fissionable materials, there has been some success since the early 1990s. That's under the initiatives of Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Luger. But Cheney, Rumsfeld, and the rest put to the side their programs to avert inevitable nuclear terror, just as they sidelined the war on terror generally, so that they could devote their energies to driving the country to war, and then their efforts to contain somehow the catastrophe that they created in Iraq. In the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the ultimate in respectability and not given to hyperbole, two well-known strategic analysts warned that Bush administration military programs and its general aggressive stance carry, in their words, an appreciable risk of ultimate doom. The reasons are straightforward. Pursuit of total security by one state entails the insecurity of others, and they're almost certain to react. They'll make use of the terrifying technology that's being developed in Rumsfeld's transformation of the military, still quoting, which will assuredly diffuse to the rest of the world. And in the context of competition and intimidation, the familiar action-reaction cycle creates rising danger, potentially an unmanageable one. Hence, transformation as currently being practiced carries an appreciable risk of ultimate doom. Well, the authors express the hope that the threat that the U.S. government is posing to its own population and to the world will be countered by a coalition of peace-loving states led by China. We've come to a pretty pass when thoughts like that are expressed at the heart of the establishment. And what they imply about the state of American democracy is no less startling. So the authors don't even consider the possibility that the American people could have anything to do about this. They have to wait for China to do it. They bring up China because, as they point out, of all the nuclear states, it has maintained by far the most restrained pattern of military deployment. Furthermore, China, for some years, has been leading the efforts at the United Nations to overcome the unilateral U.S. refusal to reserve space for peaceful purposes. The Clinton administration refused to join the rest of the world, apart from Israel, in a renewal and extension of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and they also immobilized the UN Disarmament Commission by barring any moves towards prevention of an arms race in outer space. And they gave the reasons explicitly. We should all know them. Clinton's Space Command called for, I'm quoting it, dominating the space dimension of military operations to protect U.S. interests and investment, much in the way armies and navies did in earlier years, but now with a sole hegemon, which must develop space-based strike weapons, enabling the application of precision force from, to, and through space. U.S. intelligence and the Space Command agreed in the Clinton years that such measures will be needed because, quoting again, globalization of the world economy will lead to a widening economic divide along with deepening economic stagnation, political instability, and cultural alienation, hence unrest and violence among the have-nots, much of it directed against the United States. The U.S. must therefore be ready for precision strike from space as a counter to the worldwide proliferation of weapons of mass destruction by unruly elements. That's a likely consequence of the recommended military programs, just as a widening divide, deepening economic stagnation, and so on, are the anticipated consequences of the specific form of international integration that's misleadingly called globalization and free trade in the doctrinal system. The space program falls within the framework of the officially announced Clinton doctrine that the U.S. is entitled to resort to unilateral use of military power to ensure uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. Notice that taken literally, that's far more extreme than anything that's come out of the Bush administration. Clinton's strategic command added to that Washington should portray itself as irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked, including the threat of first strike with nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states. Furthermore, nuclear weapons always cast a shadow over any crisis or conflict that extends the reach of conventional power. That strategic doctrine is not new, and it's shared across the narrow political spectrum. So President Carter's Defense Secretary, Harold Brown, had called on Congress to fund strategic nuclear capabilities because with them, our other forces become meaningful instruments of military and political power available for use throughout the Third World. You use such means only against defenseless targets, of course. It's worth remembering that while Bush and company are extreme in their reactionary statist radicalism, they're at the extreme of a dangerously narrow spectrum of the political class. That's why all these things are kept quiet. It's not things the population is supposed to learn about, though technically they're public. The threats are becoming much more serious as the Bush planners extend Clinton's doctrine of control of space for military purposes to, quoting now, to ownership of space, which may mean instant engagement anywhere in the world. They emphasize these phrases so that their meaning will be clearly understood. The purpose is to put any part of the world at risk of instant destruction thanks to sophisticated global surveillance and lethal offensive weaponry in space. Right now, the U.S. is responsible for 95% of the total world spending for militarization of space, and it's only to be expected that potential targets will react, increasing the danger to everyone. And that's, in fact, already happening. As was expected, Russia reacted to Bush's vast increase in offensive military capacity by sharply increasing its own capacities aimed at the United States. China's following suit, expanding offensive capacities to preserve its deterrent. It's very small now, but it'll grow. China's so far reluctant reaction will have a ripple effect in India first, then Pakistan in response to India, then beyond. Both U.S. and Chinese analysts recognize that, almost in the same words, that current U.S. plans are likely to set off an arms race in space. Now, that includes what's euphemistically called missile defense, which is understood on all sides to be a first strike weapon. The program of missile defense is commonly criticized as a colossal waste of money because it won't work. That's the good news. It's far more dangerous if there's any sign that it might work. Adversaries have to make a worst-case analysis, and if there's any sign that it might work, they will react by developing means to overwhelm or bypass it, which are a lot more easy than constructing it, and that will greatly increase the threat to survival. In fact, it's already happening. In the current issue, the March issue of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which is sort of a standard monitor on these things, they report that, quote, the emerging U.S. anti-ballistic missile defense system has provoked a direct Russian response, including advanced missiles and new, more sophisticated warheads. It's exactly as was predicted several years ago, the authors also point out. Senator Nunn, who, as I said, has been in the lead of the conservative senator, been in the lead of these anti-war efforts for a long time, he wrote recently that the chances of an accidental, mistaken, or unauthorized nuclear attack might be increasing. Because of current policy choices, we're running an unnecessary risk of an Armageddon of our own making. Like the others, Nunn is referring to the sharp expansion of U.S. military programs, which tilt the strategic balance in ways that make Russia more likely to launch upon warning of an attack without waiting to see if the warning is accurate. And that's no joke. The threat is enhanced by the fact, I'm continuing to quote him, that the Russian early warning system is in serious disrepair and more likely to give a false warning of incoming missiles. And U.S. systems are very dangerous. U.S. reliance on the high alert, hair trigger nuclear posture allows missiles to be launched within minutes, forcing our leaders to decide almost instantly whether to launch nuclear weapons once they have a computer warning of an attack. It robs them of the time they may need to gather data, exchange information, gain perspective, discover an error, and avoid a catastrophic mistake. And we know of our own systems that there are hundreds of such errors just caught in time. The anticipated Russian reaction to Bush administration aggressive militarism, Nunn says, increases the risk of an Armageddon of our own making, well beyond even the current intolerable level. Well, these dangers are being consciously escalated by the threat and use of violence, which, just as predicted, is stimulating nuclear proliferation and is also stimulating the jihadi terrorism that traces back to Reagan administration programs to organize, arm, and train radical Islamists, not for the defense of Afghanistan, as was proclaimed, but for the usual and ugly reasons of state, with grim consequences for the tormented people of Afghanistan, and for Pakistanis, and for the world, as the Reaganites cheerfully tolerated Pakistan's slide toward radical Islamic extremism under the rule of Zia-ul-Haq, who was one of the many brutal dictators supported by the current incumbents in Washington and their mentors then and today. We may recall that one of them has the familiar name Saddam Hussein, and they were also Reagan and associates looked away politely while their Pakistani ally was developing nuclear weapons, annually endorsing the pretense that Pakistan was not doing so. And as we should know, they were also helping their friend Saddam Hussein not to do the same. That continued long after after Saddam's worst atrocities, and also long after the end of the war with Iran. And we also know the reasons, at least if we want to, because they were kind enough to tell us. Interesting reasons, all worth remembering. McGuire reminds us of something that is barely known. So remind isn't quite right. The fact is that in 1986, recognizing what he calls the dreadful logic of nuclear weapons, Mikhail Gorbachev called for their total elimination. That proposal foundered on Reagan's militarization of space programs, what are called Star Wars. NATO doctrine at that time, McGuire points out, as I said, he was one of the planners, was explicitly premised on the credible threat of first use of nuclear weapons, and that continues to be policy today. Russia kept to the same doctrine until 1994, when it reversed its stand, adopting a no first use policy and calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, that was a very hopeful step, but Washington's reaction and our inaction, which is worth remembering, quickly brought these quite hopeful prospects to an end. Russia reverted to NATO doctrine and abandoned its call for abolition of nuclear weapons. That was in response to Clinton's expansion of NATO in violation of Washington's categorical assurance to Gorbachev that if he would agree to a reunited Germany remaining in NATO, then the NATO alliance would not expand eastward to absorb former members of the Warsaw Pact. That was the assurance violated by Clinton. And in the light of recent history, not to speak of strategic truisms, Clinton's violation of these firm pledges posed a very serious threat to Russia, a serious security threat. Clinton's violation of these assurances also explains why NATO rejected Russian proposals for a nuclear weapons-free zone, including Central Europe from the Arctic to the Black Sea. That would have interfered with Clinton's plans to extend NATO eastward in violation of the firm commitment not to do so. All of this, of course, enhanced the likelihood of apocalypse soon, which is rarely a high priority for planners. Actually, the low priority assigned to national security is so abundantly illustrated that it takes real effort to miss it. So take the war in Iraq. It was undertaken with the expectation that it would probably increase terror and nuclear proliferation. Now, U.S. and other intelligence agencies and analysts confirm that that's exactly what happened. So to take just one of many examples, last May, the CIA reported, quoting, that Iraq has become a magnet for Islamic militants similar to Soviet-occupied Afghanistan 2 decades ago and Bosnia in the 1990s, and also that Iraq may prove to be an even more effective training ground for Islamic extremists than Afghanistan was in al-Qaeda's early days, because it is serving as a real-world laboratory for urban combat. The invasion of Iraq also had the predicted effect of greatly strengthening the popular appeal of anti-democratic radicals such as those of al-Qaeda and other jihadi Salafis throughout extremist Islamic fundamentalists throughout the Muslim world, still quoting. Terrorism specialist Peter Bergen says that President Bush is right that Iraq is a main front in the war on terrorism, but this is a front that we created, he says. As the Iraq war has expanded the terrorist ranks, The year 2003 saw the highest incidence of significant terrorist attacks in 2 decades. And then in 2004, astonishingly, that number tripled. In response to Donald Rumsfeld's search for what he calls metrics to know if we're winning or losing the war on terror, Bergen suggests that an exponentially rising number of terrorist attacks is one metric that seems relevant, actually very relevant since it was anticipated. Sometimes the threat is accelerated in quite remarkable ways. So it's common to say that no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq after exhaustive search, but that's not quite accurate. There were WMD facilities found in Iraq, namely those that were provided to Saddam in the 1980s by the US and Britain and others. The storage sites had been secured by UN inspectors who were dismantling the weapons, but the inspectors were dismissed by the invading armies, and the sites were left unguarded. The inspectors did continue to carry out their work using satellite imagery. They discovered massive looting of these installations in over 100 sites, sophisticated, careful, massive looting that included, they knew it was there, that included equipment for producing missiles, biotoxins, other materials usable for chemical and biological weapons, high-precision equipment capable of making parts for nuclear and chemical weapons. Where they went, we'd prefer not to guess. The ironies are almost inexpressible. And they should be front-page headlines every day in the newspaper. The official justification for the US-UK invasion was to prevent the use of WMD that did not exist. The invasion provided the terrorists who had been mobilized by the United States and its allies with the means to develop WMD, weapons of mass destruction, namely the equipment that they had provided to Saddam, caring nothing about the terrible crimes they later invoked to whip up support for the invasion. It's as if Iran were now making nuclear weapons using fissionable material provided by the United States to Iran, which may indeed be happening. That brings us to another imminent crisis, Iran's nuclear programs. Well, that's a serious problem. No sane person wants Iran to develop nuclear weapons. And there are constructive steps that can be taken to prevent that. But first, again, we have to pay some attention to what is in fact happening. Those who hold the clubs typically take the position that history is bunk, old-fashioned, irrelevant, don't have to waste time on it. The victims don't have that luxury, nor do those who want to understand the world instead of just having blind faith in their dear leaders, to borrow the North Korean expression, which applies all too aptly, I'm afraid. Let's have a quick look at a little recent and current history that Iranians know very well and rightly regard as highly pertinent, although it's swept under the rug here. To begin with, Iranians remember very well that the policies that Washington is now condemning are the very same policies that the U.S. advocated before the 1979 overthrow of the Shah, that is, the tyrant who was imposed by the U.S.-UK military coup in 1953 that destroyed parliamentary democracy in Iran. Today, the standard claim is that Iran has no need for nuclear power, so it must be pursuing a secret weapons program. So Henry Kissinger explains that for an oil producer such as Iran, nuclear energy is a wasteful use of resources. That's now. When the Shah was in charge, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger held that introduction of nuclear power will both provide for the growing needs of Iran's economy and free remaining oil reserves for export or conversion to petrochemicals. And the U.S. acted to assist these efforts, with Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld also playing significant roles. U.S. universities were arranging to train Iranian nuclear engineers, doubtless with Washington's approval, probably Washington's initiative. My own university, MIT, for example, where that was done over enormous student opposition when the news leaked. Kissinger was asked about his reversal, and he responded with his usual engaging frankness. He said, well, then they were an allied country, so therefore they had a genuine need for nuclear energy, precept 1979, but today they're an enemy, so of course they have no such need. Well, Iranians may not be impressed by the logic. Washington's charges about an Iranian nuclear weapons program may for once be accurate. Many analysts have observed that it would be remarkable if they were not accurate, even though we have no evidence for it. Well, as I mentioned, it was anticipated that the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq would increase not only terror, but also nuclear proliferation. And it's now widely agreed that both predictions were confirmed. Reviewing these conclusions, one of Israel's leading military historians, Martin von Crefeld, writes that after the invasion of Iraq, had the Iranians not tried to build nuclear weapons, they would be crazy. The reasons are straightforward. Washington has gone out of its way to instruct Iran on the need for a powerful deterrent, not only by invading Iraq, but also by strengthening the offensive forces of its Israeli client, which already is the regional superpower, already has hundreds of nuclear weapons, as well as air and armored forces that are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power outside the U.S. Small country, but as an offshoot of the United States, that can happen, and it does. For several years, Israel has been receiving the biggest shipment in its history of advanced U.S. jet bombers, very publicly advertised as capable of bombing Iran, also equipped with unspecified special weaponry, a term that's meant for the ears of Iranian intelligence, and deep penetration bombs. Well, Iranian President Ahmadinejad has been criticized, rightly, for outrageous statements. But just try to imagine what the reaction would be if he would go on to announce that Iran is preparing to bomb the United States and Israel and taking very credible steps to do so. Well, the country would be blown away. But the imperial mentality that's been instilled by centuries of history ensures that Western leaders are exempt from any such strictures and are free to act as they like when dealing with the lower orders. That's just instinctive, so requires no comment. It's agreed on all sides that Iran's current activities, at least as far as they're known, fall within its legal rights as a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a central part of the thin thread on which survival hangs. Article 4 of the NPT grants non-nuclear states the right to produce fuel for reactors. Washington demands that Article 4 should be revised and restricted, and in fact a good case can be made for that. The Article 4 option made sense in 1970 when the NPT came into force, but with contemporary technology, producing fuel for reactors is just a step away from nuclear weapons. So restriction of Article 4 is perfectly sensible. However, any such revision of Article 4 would have to ensure unimpeded access, as the treaty says, for non-military use. That's part of the NPT bargain. Actually, a reasonable proposal for that was put forth by Mohammed El-Baradei, head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, last year's Nobel Peace Laureate. His proposal was that all production and processing of weapons-usable material should be restricted exclusively to facilities under multinational control, accompanied above all by an assurance that legitimate would-be users could get their supplies. That should be the first step, he proposed, towards fully implementing the 1993 UN Security Council resolution calling for what's called a fissile material cutoff treaty. In shorthand, it's referred to as FISPAN, which would cap and make public all inventories of fissile material still available. El-Baradei's proposal, which is quite reasonable, was dead in the water. The U.S. political leadership, surely in its current stance, would never agree to abrogate its unique exemption from international law and treaty obligations. So Washington's call for restricting Article 4 is regarded by much of the world, quite rationally, as the cynical intention to convert the NPT to a convenient instrument of U.S. foreign policy, quoting McGuire again. Well, to my knowledge, there is only one country that has officially accepted El-Baradei's proposal, namely Iran. On February 16th, Iranian spokesman and top nuclear negotiator Ali Larijani stated, quoting him, that should a credible international system for providing nuclear fuel be in place, the Islamic Republic of Iran would be ready to procure its nuclear fuel from that system. Well, that would terminate the crisis and be a great advance forward in preserving the species. Well, does Iran really mean it? There's only one way to find out, but that path can't be taken as long as the facts are suppressed. I doubt if any of you have heard them, including Washington's flat rejection of El-Baradei's proposal, or in fact any proposal that would limit its unique authority to do what it likes. Article 4 is one of two paired articles of the NPT. The other's Article 6, which obliges the nuclear powers to make good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. It's a binding legal obligation, as the World Court determined a decade ago. None of the nuclear powers have lived up to their commitments, but the U.S. is far in the lead in rejecting them and is alone in officially rejecting. There's a regular 5-year review of the NPT. The last one was last May. It was a total disaster. There was press coverage, but it kept to Washington's agenda, blaming the failure on Iran. In the real world, the primary reason for the collapse of the conference was Washington's rejection of all serious prior commitments. That was explicit, and its announcement that it is exempt from Article 6. That's not to speak of its open plans to develop new nuclear weapons, apparently underway. Well, if that's not abrogated, that stand essentially terminates the NPT with awesome consequences for proliferation. Another central part of the NPT compact was the commitment of the nuclear powers to enact and implement additional treaties. That includes the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which was rejected by the Republican Senate in 1999 and declared off the agenda by Bush. The ABM Treaty, which Bush rescinded, and most important, a verifiable FISPAN, which would prevent any further additions of nuclear bomb material to the vast amount already existing. In July 2004, Washington announced its opposition to to a verifiable fifth ban on the grounds that effective verification would compromise core national security interests. Nevertheless, in November 2004, the UN Committee on Disarmament voted on a verifiable fifth ban. The vote was 147-1 with 2 abstentions. Israel, which is reflexive, and Britain, which is more interesting. The British ambassador explained that Britain supports a verifiable fifth ban, but had to abstain because this version had divided the international community, namely 147-1. Well, that gives us some insight into the ranking of survival of the species among the priorities of the leadership of the hegemonic power and its spear carrier, and of their information systems, too. Now, this is probably maybe the most important vote in the history of the UN. As far as I can determine, it was not even reported outside of specialist journals, and the whole matter is unknown to the only people who can do something about it, namely the general public. Well, a few days later, the General Assembly again called upon all states, quoting, to contribute actively to the objective of the peaceful use of outer space and of the prevention of an arms race in outer space, and to refrain from actions contrary to that objective. The resolution passed 178-0 with 4 abstentions: the United States, Israel, Haiti, and Palau. The vote again reveals priorities, as does the coverage. In the United States, as far as I can determine, 0. These are very good ways to march on, following our leaders, to an Armageddon of our own making. Let's go back to Iran. Several years ago, the European Union and Iran, as you know, reached an agreement on Iran's uranium enrichment programs. That we know, but not what the agreement was. Here's an account of it by one of the most respected specialists on these topics, Zia-ul-Haq, writing in the world's leading business journal, the London Financial Times. He writes that the nuclear negotiations between Iran and the European Union were based on a bargain that the European Union, held back by the United States, has failed to honor. Iran agreed to suspend its uranium enrichment efforts temporarily. The EU promised to put forward proposals for economic incentives and security guarantees. The language of the joint declaration was unambiguous, he says. Here's what it was. A mutual acceptable agreement would not only provide objective guarantees that Iran's nuclear program is exclusively for peaceful purposes, but would equally provide firm commitments by the EU on security issues. Well, everyone understands the meaning of the phrase security issues. It refers to the very credible U.S.-Israeli threats and preparations to attack Iran, which is no joke for a country that's been tortured by the global superpower for 50 years, including Washington's support for Saddam Hussein's murderous war against Iran, the superpower that now occupies the countries on Iran's border, and that's not to speak of the regional superpower that's its client state. Well, Iran lived up to its side of the bargain, but the EU, under U.S. pressure, rejected its commitments and refused to discuss security issues. Iran then abandoned the bargain as well. That's where we are now, not quite the way it's portrayed. The background is extended by British physicist Norman Chomsky. He's long been active in efforts to implement the Russell-Einstein plea. He reviews the same picture, and he adds that the United States turned down Iran's offer to discuss security matters, including the nuclear program, in May 2003. And as he points out, the Bush administration followed the same course with North Korea when it took office in January 2001. It refused to confirm that it was bound by the no hostile intent statement of earlier agreements, then went on to issue serious threats, and it abandoned the promised fuel oil shipments and the reactor project. North Korea withdrew from the NPT, locked out the inspectors, started up its plutonium-producing reactor and processing plant, and later announced that it possessed nuclear weapons, all as anticipated. Well, it's clear enough how to reduce these grim prospects. In case of Iran, in both cases, in fact, call off the threats that are practically urging Iran to develop nuclear weapons, join with the rest of the world, most of it, in taking steps to reintegrate Iran within the global economy, and accept the Fist-Ban Treaty, which leading specialists here regard as the most fundamental nuclear arms proposal. That's Princeton physicist and arms control specialist Frank von Hippel. And then move on to the legal obligation to close down the nuclear arsenals. In fact, even steps in those directions would mitigate the upcoming crisis. We might ask why Washington is so intent on punishing Iran that it's even willing to increase nuclear proliferation and the threat of nuclear war. Actually, that should come as no surprise to anyone familiar with the record of internal planning and of history. So why did the United States insist on bombing Serbia in 1999? Well, there's a standard claim that the goals were humanitarian. Now, that was at once exploded, even by the rich documentary record provided by official Western sources. But by now, the real reasons have been provided by high officials of the Clinton administration who were in charge of the enterprise. Quote, "It was Yugoslavia's resistance to the broader trends of political and economic reform, not the plight of Kosovar Albanians, that explains NATO's war." In brief, Serbia was not following orders. That's familiar too. So why has the United States been torturing Cubans for over 45 years? The internal record from the early 1960s is quite explicit. The reason was what it calls Cuba's successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years. And that means going back to the Monroe Doctrine. No Russians, but the Monroe Doctrine, which declared that the United States is to be the ruler of the hemisphere. And you don't tolerate successful defiance of that. You don't understand why, just ask your favorite mafia don. He'll explain it to you. Iran falls into the very same pattern. It's a familiar one. Another factor accelerating the threat of terror and nuclear war is the U.S.-Israeli rejection of the broad international consensus on a diplomatic settlement of the Israel-Arab conflict. It's now been going on for 30 years, the rejection. The first U.S. veto of a Security Council resolution calling for a two-state settlement on the international border was in January 1976, and the record then continues. And it continues as we meet with ongoing U.S.-Israeli programs to take over the valuable lands and resources of the West Bank, leaving unviable cantons, which are virtually separated from one another and from whatever fragment will be left of Arab East Jerusalem, which is the center of Palestinian cultural, educational, commercial life and institutions. All of these are now to be imprisoned within Israel with U.S. backing, as always. As Israel proceeds, it's now official, it's already been clear, but it's now official that Israel will proceed to take over the Jordan Valley and gradually expel its inhabitants, leaving the cantons prisons, basically. Just take a look at a map, and you'll see what all of this means. Well, there's a lot more to say about that and about the Hamas victory, but time is pretty short, and that would take us too far afield, so maybe we can return to it. The critical question today is, of course, Iraq. There has been a lot of talk about exit strategies, but none of that can be taken seriously unless it faces some fundamental issues that are sort of kept out of sight for doctrinal reasons, but surely dominate the thinking of policy planners. We hear plenty of impressive rhetoric about Washington's dedication to a sovereign and democratic Iraq, but a moment's thought suffices to show that any such outcome would be a nightmare to Washington planners. That's why the occupying authorities fought so hard to prevent elections, and when they couldn't prevent them, turned at once to trying to subvert them. And we should remember that, and be impressed by the fact that elections took place at all was a real triumph of nonviolent popular resistance that the occupying armies couldn't handle. And the reasons are pretty obvious. Just consider the policies that a sovereign and moderately democratic Iraq would be likely to adopt. Well, Iraqis may have no great love for Iran, but they would prefer friendly relations with their powerful neighbor to antagonism and conflict. Furthermore, the Shiite religious and political leadership has very close traditional links with Iran, and these are now expanding. Shiite success in Iraq is already invigorating the pressures for freedom and rights among the bitterly oppressed Shiite populations right across the border in Saudi Arabia. These tendencies will only increase if Iraq gains some measure of sovereignty, which that happens to be the region where most of Saudi oil is. So the outcome, just think it through, could well be a Shiite-dominated alliance comprising the major oil-producing regions of Iraq, which are enormous, Iran, and the major oil regions of Saudi Arabia, all independent of Washington and controlling the bulk of the world's energy resources. That could mean that the United States would lose control over the world's major energy supplies. These have long been recognized to be, quote, documents of the 1940s, a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Strategic power means what's called critical leverage over industrial rivals. That's Zbigniew Brzezinski's observation recently referring to the hoped-for benefits of the invasion of Iraq. That outcome is Washington's ultimate nightmare. Almost could get worse. It's not unlikely that an independent bloc of this kind might develop major energy projects jointly with China and India, perhaps even allying with the Asian Energy Security Grid and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Those are based in China and Russia. Perhaps will incorporate India, which has been developing joint projects with China aimed at Asian integration and independence. Bush's visit to India the last couple of days is one of the many efforts to impede these clear tendencies, which are likely to continue anyway. And it's likely, almost certain, that South Korea and the Southeast Asian countries will also join. Japan's kind of uncertain, but it might. The prospect that Europe and Asia might move towards greater independence has seriously troubled U.S. planners ever since World War II. And those concerns have considerably increased in the last several decades as what's called the tripolar world has continued to evolve. Three major centers, North America, Europe, mainly Northeast Asia. In addition, now there are, for the first time, quite important South-South interactions, mainly Brazil, South Africa, and India. And there's also rapidly growing European Union engagement with China, which are perhaps now or very soon each other's largest trading partners. Well, loss of the critical leverage would be a serious blow to plans for global dominance that trace right back to the beginning of World War II. U.S. intelligence has projected that the United States would control Middle East oil for the traditional reasons, but that the United States itself would rely mainly on what are called more stable Atlantic basin resources. That means West Africa and the Western Hemisphere. Control of Middle East oil is now far from a sure thing, and these expectations are also threatened by very important developments in the Western Hemisphere, which in fact are being accelerated by Bush administration's policies, which have left the United States remarkably isolated in the global arena. The Bush administration even succeeded in alienating Canada, and that's a really impressive feat. It takes genius to do that. The reason is Washington's brazen rejection of NAFTA decisions favoring Canada. The U.S. government just told them to get lost. Well, that may accelerate establishment of closer Canada-China relations. In fact, that's what Canadian officials have been saying in reaction. Canadian officials have said that Canada may shift a significant portion of its trade, particularly oil exports, from the United States to China. In a further blow to Washington's energy policies, the leading oil exporter in the hemisphere, Venezuela, has forged probably the closest relations with China of any Latin American country and is planning to sell increasing amounts of oil to China. That's part of its effort to reduce its dependence on the very hostile, openly hostile U.S. government. In fact, Latin America as a whole is increasing trade and other relations with China. There are some setbacks, but likely expansion. That's particularly true for the major raw material exporters, Brazil and Chile. Meanwhile, for the first time since the Spanish conquest, Latin America is moving towards closer integration, independent of Washington. Venezuela just joined the South American Customs Union, Mercosur. That's a move described by Argentine President Kirchner as a milestone in the development of this trading bloc. It's welcomed as opening a new chapter in our integration by Brazilian President Lula da Silva. There was a meeting in Uruguay convened to mark Venezuela's formal entry into Mercosur. Venezuelan President Chavez said that we cannot allow this to be purely an economic project, one for the elites and for the transnational companies. That's a not very oblique reference to the U.S.-sponsored free trade agreement for the Americas, which is highly unpopular in Latin America. Venezuela also supplied Argentina with oil to help starve off an energy crisis, and it bought part of Argentina's debt. That's one element of a very important region-wide effort to free the countries from the controls of the IMF after 2 decades of disastrous effects of conformity to the rules imposed by the U.S.-dominated international financial institutions. The IMF has acted towards our country as a promoter and vehicle of policies that caused poverty and pain among the Argentine people. President Kirchner said in announcing his decision to pay almost $1 trillion to rid itself of the IMF forever with the help of Venezuela. Radically violating IMF rules, Argentina did enjoy a substantial economic recovery from the disaster left by IMF policies. Well, steps towards regional integration advanced further with the election of Evo Morales last December. He's the first president coming from the indigenous majority. And Morales moved quickly to reach a series of energy accords with Venezuela. Its gas reserves are second only to Venezuela's in South America. and Morales, too, committed himself to reversing the neoliberal policies that Bolivia had pursued rigorously for 25 years, leaving the country with a lower per capita income than at the outset. Much of the region from Venezuela to Argentina has left-center governments. The indigenous populations have, for the first time, become very active and influential, particularly in Bolivia and Ecuador, both major energy producers, where they either want oil and gas to be domestically controlled or, in some cases, oppose production altogether. Many indigenous people apparently don't see any reason why their lives and societies and cultures should be disrupted or destroyed so that New Yorkers can sit in their SUVs in traffic jams. In fact, some are even calling for an Indian nation in South America. This internal economic integration that's underway is reversing patterns that trace right back to the Spanish conquest. Ever since then, Latin American elites and economies have been linked to the imperial powers, but not to one another. And Washington's traditional mechanisms of control, namely violence and economic strangulation, they're losing their effectiveness. For many reasons, the system of global dominance is fragile, even apart from the damage that's being inflicted on it by Bush planners. Well, looking back over the actual record of policy, extricating itself from the rhetorical frame, we find that the guiding principles are clear and simple enough. Abroad, democracy is fine, but only when it takes a form that does not risk popular interference with the primary interests of power and wealth. And at home, much the same doctrine prevails. Well, no time to go into that critical matter, but I'd like to end with just a couple of words about the topic because it provides some useful and simple ideas as to how to approach and deal with the very grave problems that confront all of us. So here are a couple of suggestions. First, accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court and the World Court. Second, accept the Kyoto Protocols and carry them forward. Third, and very important, let the UN take the lead in international crises. Fourth, rely on diplomatic and economic measures rather than military ones in confronting the grave threats of terror. 5, keep to the conventional interpretation of the UN Charter, meaning the use of force is legitimate only when ordered by the Security Council or when the country is under imminent threat of attack until the Security Council can act. 6th, give up the veto at the Security Council and have a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, as the Declaration of Independence advises, even if power centers disagree. 7th, cut back sharply on military spending and sharply increase social spending, meaning health, education, renewable energy, and so on. Well, these are actually very conservative suggestions for quite a simple reason. They're the opinions of the majority of the population. In almost all cases, the overwhelming majority of the population. The overwhelming majority also wants to rescind Bush's tax cuts for anyone with incomes over $200,000, which means practically all of them. In all these cases, and there are plenty of others, public opinion is in radical opposition to public policy, and both political parties are well to the right of the general population. Well, few people are even aware of these facts for a simple reason. The regular, in-depth public opinion studies by the most prestigious institutions are scarcely reported or not reported at all when they reveal such facts as these, as they regularly do. That record's highly instructive. Well, these are far from the only constructive suggestions one can think of, but they're a pretty good start. There are also some simple truths that can be quite useful. One of them is to take democracy seriously, another is to pay attention to fact and elementary moral principles. Another is to refuse to accept the self-serving contention of the powerful that what happened in the past can be forgotten because we've undergone a miraculous change of course, something which happens every few years, is very easily demonstrated, and other simple truths. They don't answer every problem by any means, but they do carry us a long way towards developing more specific and detailed answers, as is constantly done, and more important, they open the way to implementing them. These are opportunities that are readily within our grasp in a society that's as free as ours, if we can free ourselves from the shackles of doctrine and illusion. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for what you've chosen to do in your life. And my question is, in a few words, what do you find hopeful?
Hopeful?
Yeah.
I think one should be really optimistic for exactly the reasons I mentioned in the last 2 or 3 minutes. The large majority of the population already agrees with a lot of the things that activists are committed to, so you don't have to convince them. All that's required is to overcome the democratic deficit, that is to organize people who are already convinced. These are not the only, what I mentioned is a small sample. It's quite an interesting list, and I presume that's the reason why the results of the studies are kept secret. It's a bad idea to let people know that, your neighbors think the same way you do. If you think I'm the only lunatic who has these ideas, because everything I read in the press says the opposite, then you keep quiet. It's also, I presume, the idea is the reason why elections are very consciously evacuated of content. As I mentioned, I think in the last election, 2004, only about 10% of voters even knew what the stand of the candidates was on issues. And that's done very carefully and explicitly. If any of you, I'm sure you paid attention to the elections. The elections are run, in the elections, candidates are treated as commodities. They're packaged and marketed by the same institutions, public relations industry, the same institutions that packages and markets other commodities, toothpaste, cars, lifestyle drugs, and so on. You may learn in economics courses that we have a wonderful free market based on informed consumers making rational choices, and all kinds of nice theories about that. But business despises the concept of free markets, spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year to prevent that outcome. And what's more, you all know it. Even the people answering the questions the right way in the economics courses, you know it can't be true. Anyone who's looked at a television ad knows that you're not being helped to become a rational consumer making informed choices. You're helped to become an irrational consumer making uninformed choices. That's you don't learn anything about the commodity from the television ad. You're subjected to delusion. And furthermore, it's kind of pointless even to say this because it's a truism that everybody knows. Down to my grandchildren. You don't get information from an ad about the product. It's the last place to look for information. You're subjected to imagery, deceit, delusion. You know what it's like. And it's the same thing is done when candidates are packaged and sold. Last thing you want to know, want the population to know is what their stand is on issues. Because population mostly opposes their stand on issues. They better be kept out of it. You want to keep the population out of the public arena, use the same techniques. Delusion, imagery, exactly what you see if you bother watching a campaign. So you have to keep, but I think that's a very hopeful sign. It's not a reason for pessimism. There's just no reason at all why the United States can't be, say, as democratic as the poorest country in South America. Just take a look at the last election in Bolivia, poorest country in South America. They had an actual democratic election, which is something we can't even imagine here. Here we have a choice between two commodities. two wealthy, privileged men, went to the same, you all know it, we know the whole story. Went to the same elite university, joined the same secret society where you're trained to be a member of the ruling class. You're able to run because you have pretty much the same programs, and you're funded by pretty much the same concentrations of private capital, and there's a few differences, but a narrow spectrum. And you're not given a choice between issues. In the poorest country of South America, they were able to elect a candidate from their own ranks. Everybody knew what the issues were. They were clear and important ones, and people voted for them. And they weren't manipulated by huge private institutions that are committed to imagery and deceit. Well, that's more or less democratic election. I mean, it's utterly scandalous that in the richest, most powerful, most free country in the world, we can't even dream of the kind of elections that take place in the poorest countries. That's not a hard thing to perceive, or in fact to do something about. It's ridiculous to say that we can't do what Bolivian peasants can do. So that's hopeful, but it means doing something about it. It's not going to happen by itself.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. I had a question to follow up on your comments about the exit strategy from Iraq. Last week we had a talk at Cornell given by Ambassador Lakhdar Brahimi, who was the former Undersecretary for the United Nations and also the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Algeria. And his talk was essentially talking about the crisis in Iraq. And in a nutshell, he basically described that essentially you have utter chaos in Iraq. And he fell just short of actually proposing a solution. He was actually there to help form, because he was a UN envoy to Iraq to form the Alawi government. And what he essentially said was that if the United States were to withdraw immediately from Iraq, it would essentially put the country even in further chaos. So I wanted you to reflect upon that, and I know you fell short of actually talking about an exit strategy per se, but if you have any comments on his views and your own views on that matter. Thank you.
Well, first let me just repeat what I said before. There is no point even talking about an exit strategy unless we're willing to face the fact that the U.S. will do just about anything to prevent a sovereign and more or less democratic Iraq for good, obvious reasons. I mean, unless we recognize that, we can't even talk rationally about the topic. And we're not permitted to recognize that, because that would break a firm taboo. There's an unpronounceable three-letter word that you're not allowed to say if you're in the United States or Britain or Europe. I'll just spell it because it's too bad a word, O-I-L. You're not allowed to say it. You're supposed to think and believe that Bush and Blair would have liberated Iraq even if its exports were lettuce and pickles and the main energy resource of the world were in South Pacific. Unless you believe that, you're not even allowed into the discussion. You're a conspiracy theorist or something. Among the victims, there's just no question. I mean, yes, of course, they don't understand it. We know that from polls taken in Iraq. So, for example, right after the president announced his glorious messianic mission to bring democracy to Iraq, there was a Gallup poll in Iraq published in which people were given the opportunity to express their belief in why the U.S. invaded. 1% agreed with 100% of Western opinion. We have to follow the dear leader. So, democracy and so on, because he says so. 1% it was in Baghdad, of people in Baghdad agreed. 5% said the purpose was to help Iraqis, and everyone else was a conspiracy theorist, as they're called. I said, well, obviously take control of Iraq's resources, which are enormous, extend control over the region, and so on. We're not allowed to say that. All right, if we are allowed to say it, if we break the taboo, we can see right away why any form of democracy and certainly sovereignty is just a nightmare to Washington planners. I mean, I mentioned some of the reasons, but they're pretty obvious. Unless we are willing to enter the world of rational discussion, there isn't any point talking about anything else. So if we're willing to go that far, we can then raise the question of what would be an exit strategy. Well, the first part of it, and the most crucial part, would be to overcome the enormous pressure in Washington and Britain, with the support of Europe, the rich countries, not to permit it for these reasons. That's an internal problem in the West, and that's the prime problem. Well, okay, if we can deal with that one, we can then turn to what would be good for Iraqis. And here there's a very elementary principle. I mean, we can debate about how it should, what it implies, but at least we should accept the principle. Invading armies have no rights whatsoever. They only have responsibility. The responsibility is, first of all, to compensate for the enormous damage they inevitably do. And in that case, that means for Britain and the United States, and in fact others, to pay massive reparations to Iraq, not just for the, not aid, reparations, like defeated countries are forced to pay. Reparation is not only the war and the aftermath, which is horrible enough, but a decade of sanctions, US-UK sanctions, called UN sanctions, but everybody knows that nobody wanted them except the US and Britain. So the sanctions just devastated the society, strengthened Saddam, probably kept them in power. So you got to pay for that, for supporting, for the war. I mean, there's a lot of responsibilities. So that's next. And the next thing to do is just do what the population wants. It's up to them. It's not up to us. It's up to the population to decide what's the right next step. Not up to me, not Mr. Brahimi, nice man, but it's not up to him. It's up to the people of Iraq. Well, we know pretty well what they want. I could find out more. According to British and U.S. polls, about 80% want a strict timetable for withdrawal. Nobody thinks you can withdraw in 1 second, but want a strict timetable for withdrawal. Almost half are in favor of attacks against occupying forces. That's all of Iraq. If you look at Arab Iraq, where the forces actually are, numbers are much higher. Well, okay, it's up to them to figure out what they want the occupying armies to do as best they can, without our interference, without our effort to subvert the outcome, like putting Mr. Alawi in power. Okay, that wasn't an Iraqi decision. In fact, the Iraqis were strong, which you mentioned. That was a Western, a U.S.-British decision. We know how Iraqis felt about it, because over the strong opposition of the U.S. and Britain, they were able to have elections. And in the elections, the favored U.S.-British candidate, Alawi, was given every imaginable advantage, state resources, support of the occupying forces, only person with access to television and so on. In fact, the U.S., to help out even more, drove the independent press media out of Iraq. That's very important. Can't have a free press in a country if you're going to have free elections. Well, they drove out Al Jazeera because they're one of the major democratizing forces in the Arab world. That's why they're hated by the tyrants who run the oil resources and by the United States, which wants to destroy it. And they were kicked out after their stations were bombed and a journalist killed. So Alawi had every advantage. He got around 13% of the vote. Okay, tells you how popular he is. But it's not our choice. It's their choice. However it works, I mean, we may not like it. They may not be in a great position to have elections. But, we really can't talk about that. We barely have elections at all. If we're worried about, maybe we should send Bolivia there, to teach them how to run elections or something like that. But anyway, it's up to them. So that's the principle. Okay, then you could debate how the principle gets implemented, heeding the voices of the people who have the right to make a decision. But that's as far as the rights of an occupying army can go. The rest you can talk about in academic seminars, but it doesn't have anything to do with policy, or shouldn't.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chomsky. I had a question, actually it's two parts. First part, what do you see the probability of Israel or the United States using military force or even invading Iran. My second part is, do you see Iraq becoming a theocracy similar to Iran in the future?
Well, if you'd asked me, actually, I wrote about this about a year ago, and at that time I thought the probability of the U.S. Bombing Iran, and if Israel bombs, that means it's the U.S. doing it. Israel can go just as far as the U.S. lets them. I thought the probability was very low. And now, frankly, I'm not so sure. The Bush administration and those who support it, the Spear carrier in England, actually mostly Europe, they don't say so. They amount to a very dangerous predator, extremely dangerous. And the only thing more dangerous than a violent predator is a wounded predator. So, tiger's bad enough, it's on the loose. It's wounded, it's worse. And they're very severely wounded. So it's kind of hard to say what they're going to do. I mean, it could be that they'll decide just to give up on the hope of any sensible solution and just try to hit the whole system with a sledgehammer and see what happens, Well, what happens could be horrendous, but, maybe they'll be desperate enough to take a chance. I still doubt it, but it's possible. But I really don't think there's much point speculating about the probability. What's important is to prevent it, okay? And we know how to prevent it. I mentioned a whole lot of ways to prevent it. They're all within our power to implement, every single one, beginning with getting people to be aware of what the facts are. What was the EU-Iran bargain? Why is it that only one country in the world accepts the necessary proposals to end the production of materials for nuclear weapons, which will do us all in? Okay, why must we continue 50 years of torture of the Iranian people? All of that stuff is within our grasp to do something about, and that's a lot more important than speculating about what people out of our control might do. They're not out of our control unless we want them to be. So as for that, I don't see much point in the speculation. No, I meanwhile forgot the second part of the question, which was
Do you see Iraq becoming a theocracy?
Oh, theocracy. Well, we're certainly driving it in that direction. Actually, that was going on through the 1980s and 90s. When you make people desperate enough, they're very likely to turn to religious extremism, just as a way of somehow gaining some solace and interaction in the world community, and that's what happened. One of the major effects of these really vicious sanctions, which remember killed hundreds of thousands of people and just destroyed the society, and they were strongly opposed by Iraqi dissidents and by Westerners who knew Iraq best, but which is why they were kept out of the media here. You didn't read Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck in the U.S. press because they knew too much. They were the people directing the Oil for Food program. They had hundreds of investigators all over Iraq. They knew more than any Westerner. And they were, like Iraqi dissidents, bitterly opposed to the sanctions. They all argued that unless the U.S. allows some kind of society to reconstruct, there's no way for them to throw out the tyrant. If it reconstructs, they can probably send them in the same direction as the other tyrants, many of them equal to Saddam, who the U.S. supported right to the end, and Britain, and who were overthrown from within. There's a long string of them. Ceausescu, Suharto, and Marcos, Duvalier, get a long list. Chun in South Korea, they were overthrown from within when some kind of society could sustain itself. That's why Halliday resigned in 1998, saying that the sanctions are genocidal, and why von Sponeck resigned 2 years later, same thing. And they're very respected international bureaucrats, diplomats, which is why I presume they were blanked out of the U.S. media. They knew too much, just as Iraqi dissidents were, except the selected group, picked up by the neocons. How good their knowledge of Iraq was. One of the effects of the sanctions was to increase religious fundamentalist commitments. That's pretty natural to be expected. The invasion and the war have accelerated these tendencies strongly. And by now, there's always been conflicts in the society, like every society, but nothing like today. You take a look at Iraqi history. It's nothing like today. That's after the invasion and a consequence of the invasion. We might remember a small event called the Nuremberg Tribunals, in which Nazi war criminals were hanged. And the worst crime that they were hanged for was what the tribunal called the supreme international crime, which encompasses within it all the evil that follows. Okay? All the evil that follows. That crime is aggression. Right? So everything that follows from the aggression, including Abu Ghraib, the so-called insurgency, the resistance, the blowing up of Samarra Mosque, whatever happens, that's encompassed in the supreme international crime. And that's what the Nazi war criminals were hanged for. And the American Chief Counsel, Justice Jackson, made some very eloquent and I think very sincere statements saying that this judgment must apply universally. It must apply to us. He said, we're handing these criminals a poisoned chalice, and we're going to have to drink from it too if we're guilty. Okay, that's something else that's up to us. One of the things, to the extent that a religiously based conflict is developing, and it surely is, that's part of the evil encompassed in the supreme international crime. So sure, it's visibly happening. I don't see much point speculating on how far it's going to go. Much more important, like infinitely more important, is doing what we can to stop contributing to it.
I wanted to ask you a question about American complicity in sort of funding and training Muslim militants, specifically in the context of education. And there's been a lot of speculation after 9/11 that failed schools, madrasas, religious schools in Muslim countries are sort of incubating terrorism and things like that. But I wanted to actually ask you the question in terms of Professor Mahmood Madani writes in his book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. He gives an example of the University of Nebraska that got an American government grant to produce textbooks for Afghani children. And there's actually one example he gives them that's very sort of peculiar in that the University of Nebraska Education Department was writing textbooks about math problems in which they were asking children to put themselves in the situation of an Afghani mujahid who's either a terrorist or a holy warrior, depending on your perspective, being ambushed by a group of Russian soldiers, and he proceeds to kill four Russians out of 11. So the question asked is how many Russians are left? And so I wanted to ask you, and sort of, what do we make of this, that our government's funding these projects and sending these things over there that's sort of incubating its own form of militarism?
Well, did you say Mahmood Madani?
Yeah, Mahmood Madani.
He knows what he's talking about, and that's a good book. He really knows the subject, so I'm sure what he said is accurate. But the major contribution that the U.S. made to religious fanaticism and extremism in the schools was what I alluded to. A lot of it is coming straight out of the Pakistani madrasas. Mm-hmm. Who was establishing them? Well, the dictator that we were supporting. We were supporting him. The Reagan administration, the guys now in office, were supporting Zia-ul-Haq as he was dismantling the Pakistani educational system, replacing it with a system of madrasas, which are actually a kind of a mixed bag, but the ones that you're referring to and that are having a dangerous effect, we're simply training people in religious extremism. And meanwhile, as I said, the same guys in Washington were pretending that Pakistan isn't producing nuclear weapons, though they knew it was, and so on. A good friend of mine who's a leading nuclear physicist at Pakistani, who one of the leading peace activists there too, an anti-nuclear activist, described to me what he's been teaching physics in one of the universities for, 20 or 30 years. He says, they used to have a pretty high level of incoming students. And now, he says, the incoming students, just a large number of them, just don't have the beginning of the preparation for taking science courses, or for that matter, any courses, and furthermore are indoctrinated to believe that it's worthless. Like trying to teach biology to somebody who went through the school system in Kansas or something. You're not going to be able to do it. It's written about it, which is pretty courageous in Pakistan. It's not like here. You're taking real chances when you try to tell the truth. This is going on. And we played a major role in it. That's another thing we ought to be paying reparations for and trying to reverse somehow. A lot of it was Saudi funding. Remember, Saudi Arabia is the most extreme fundamentalist Islamic state, the worst tyranny in the Arab world. Our U.S. ally, from its origins, close U.S. ally as it is today. And the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and especially in the 80s, made an enormous contribution to this, just as it essentially organized the extremist Islamic terrorist groups. It's where Osama bin Laden comes from and the rest of them. Major contribution. Yes, sure, it's really happening. We've got a huge responsibility for it, and there's a lot we could do to try to help reverse it. But again, you got to do it. It's not going to happen by itself.
Thank you.
Professor Chomsky, I want to thank you as a fellow academic and also an organizer for giving us a great organizing opportunity in this space. And I have a comment and a question. The comment has to do with one group of people that's in this audience, which is a lot of leaders and followers of a huge local progressive movement that have made great gains over the last year or so. The other is the undergraduates. Briefly, in the last year, we've seen the growth of a progressive media center, an independent media center here, and you can see the bridge, 5,000 copies, which is out here floating around. This organization has been a backbone of progressive communications, and it leads to the second thing, which Marianne Grady behind me will mention and ask you about in 2 questions, which is that the St. Patrick's Four here really shone a spotlight on the problems with justice and dealing with the issues you raised in connection with Justice Jackson. And hundreds of people for a week attended a tribunal outside the proceedings of the trial where these 4 nonviolent activists were being tried for a rather minor crime for trying to stop a rather major one. At the same time, progressive labor leaders have now moved to the head of the local AFL-CIO federation. And last but not least, we've elected a very progressive mayor to the city of Binghampton. Now, that said, he's standing in the back, Matt Ryan.
Congratulations.
That said, a question that I get all the time after my human rights class, Professor Chomsky, I've heard about the realities of what's going on here, but what concretely can I, a 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old undergraduate who is just coming to these realities, what can I do here and now on the campus, in my community, something? Give some sort of a concrete example of something that young people have done that you've seen, because you travel all over the country and all over the world, and I'm sure you have many such. Thank you.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, I ended up enlisting a series of very straightforward things that people can organize about and advocate and implement, because they happen to be very conservative proposals the majority of the population, the overwhelming majority, wants anyway. Now, there's no secret about what you do about those things. That's how did the Bolivian peasants manage to elect Evo Morales? They don't ask, what can I do? They go ahead and do it, and the same is true, and we know what we can do. If you want to know what's been achieved, there's a huge record of it. Why is this the most free country in the world? Which it is. It wasn't given as a gift. It certainly wasn't true in the past. The hideous record. Even if you just take freedom of speech, it's a major achievement. It's a crucial human right, freedom of speech. By now, it's protected in the United States better than in any other country I know of. The U.S. Supreme Court has set standards for protection of freedom of speech that, as far as I know, are unique in the world. Is that in the Bill of Rights? No. Is it in American history? No. In fact, the issues didn't even reach the courts. They may be words somewhere, but they don't mean anything. The issues didn't reach the courts till the 20th century, and then very weakly. And in fact, a high standard for protection of freedom of speech was reached in 1964. That was in a case involving Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, by then that was a mass popular movement. Limited in focus, but mass popular movement. And in that context, the court supported King and the civil rights movement in a crucial case and set a high standard of protection of freedom of speech, which went beyond in the 60s as a result of activism. Well, that's standard. You run through the rights. They were won. They weren't granted. And we know how they were won. And the young people were right in the lead. I mean, just take the example of the civil rights movement. Who was leading it? Well, it's right to honor Martin Luther King. He was an important figure, but he would have been the first person to say that he was a follower, not a leader. I mean, the people who were leading the civil rights movement were mostly students, young black students, some white ones in the South, who were right on the front lines every day, whether it was sitting in lunch counters or riding freedom buses and facing serious dangers, beaten, sometimes killed, mostly forgotten, like most leaders. But they were at the forefront of creating a movement which ultimately had major effects. Just consider by now we kind of take it for granted, but it's very recent, so look at it. I mean, probably the popular movement from the 60s, actually the 70s, that had the biggest impact on the general culture is the women's movement. Where'd that come from? I mean, was it a gift from the Supreme Court? It came from a lot of activism, starting with small consciousness-raising groups, movements, activities, education. It's changed the whole country. I mean, in fact, a lot of the world. In this respect, there's just huge difference. It's not only here. I mean, I just happened to be reading an article on banana workers in the Caribbean who are miserably oppressed. But it turns out that there has been, for the first time, a women's movement among the banana workers who have brought forward women's issues. And like everywhere else, they're the most oppressed. And they've succeeded in making gains, bringing in others beyond what the labor movements have ever achieved in the past. I mean, if we helped them, they could do even more, And that's going on all over the world, and it happened because a lot of people were willing to go out and work day after day. I mean, we're indoctrinated, in the rich, privileged societies. You're kind of indoctrinated with the notion that you have to have instant gratification. Like I went to a demonstration and nothing happened, so what can I do? Or I pushed a lever every 4 years and nothing happened, so what can I do? That's not the way it works. I mean, it works by constant engagement, hard, constant, regular work, which builds up popular movements. There's a reason why there's a huge democratic revival in the South, in South America, but not here. There's a reason why the World Social Forum regularly meets in Porto Alegre and Mumbai and Caracas and so on, not in New York and Berlin and so on. The reason is that the South is way in the lead in developing meaningful democracy, and under far harsher conditions than we face, incomparably harsher conditions, with none of the opportunities that we have. I mean, we can sit and watch and say, well, what can I do about it? And the answer is everything they do magnified by 100 or 1,000, because we have so many more opportunities. And it certainly has made changes. I mean, just in the last couple of decades, there have been enormous changes on all sorts of issues. And young people are quite often, not always, but quite often in the lead. Take the global justice movements, what are ludicrously called anti-globalization movements. Called anti-globalization because they're pro-globalization for people, not profits. So that makes them anti-globalization. But these are, did they ever exist in the past? I mean, it was unheard of until the last few years. These are mass popular movements. They're all over the place. I mean, sort of visible in the World Social Forum, but that's spawned regional and local social forums all over, lots of ongoing activism, different things in different places. Young people are mostly in the forefront of that. Not entirely, but mostly. That's just the last couple of years. And go back further, and there's still more. These are all things that can be done. But they are not going to be done by intermittent participation in something. They're going to be done by constant involvement, which doesn't mean 100% of your time, but like you're always around. You're part of an organization. It's always doing something. You help when you can. You do the kinds of things that have to be done next. They may be small things, but they add up. That's what you can do. It's the way changes come in the past. It's the way significant changes have come in the recent past, and that's the way it'll go on. There's no other magic key that anybody knows. There is, I've noticed, as you say, I travel around a lot, in fact, around the world, into all kinds of communities here, too, and in the rich countries. Liverpool's different from Oxford, and poor communities in the slums here are different from, elite universities. And I can't prove it, but there's a correlation which is so clear. It's got to have, I think it's meaningful. And the correlation is that the principle is that the more privilege, wealth, and opportunity people have, the more they feel helpless. Just think about it. I think that's very generally the case. Now, I think you can even answer the question why. Because wealth and privilege are associated with massive indoctrination from infancy to make you feel helpless, isolated, incapable of doing anything, alone, and so on. But it's just not true. It's only true if you accept the indoctrination. So, I think there's plenty of easy answers.
Professor Chomsky, thank you very much for the very large body of your great work, and thank you so much for coming to Binghamton. If we look at the 2004 presidential race, there was, on matters of great importance, matters of war and peace, there wasn't a large amount of difference between the two major candidates. And if we look at the outcome of the election, I believe it was 49 to 51%. That statistically looks like a coin toss. In 2003, you signed a letter along with a very large number of high-profile former 2000 Ralph Nader supporters urging people, in effect, to that this election was too important to let that the issues get in the way of things, that this election was strategic, and we basically had to vote Bush out of office. I'm wondering if you could reflect on the wisdom of that strategy.
Right. That was exactly the right position, and it was exactly the position I took for the 2000 election. Same one, exactly. And there's a good reason for it. There was no alternative. Ralph Nader's a very nice person. He's done lots of important things, but he does not make a contribution to political democracy. You do not make a contribution to political democracy by showing up every 4 years and saying, vote for me, without a, in fact, what does the vote mean? Who are the senators on the ticket? Who are the governors? Who are the local representatives? Who's the representative for school board? A political organization is something, like, take the Brazilian Workers' Party. A million things wrong with it, but it's an actual political party. Which people participate. It has programs, and they're constantly working on them, and they're connected to mass popular movements, loosely connected, like the landless workers movement and others. The same with the indigenous movements in Bolivia. And the same in the past when there was a level of functioning democracy here. Okay, so the choice in 2000 and in 2004 was highly restricted. The position that letter actually took in 2004 and in 2000, same, is if you're in a safe state, you know which way it's going to go, then do what you think is right. If you think it's right to vote for Nader, vote for Nader. If you think it's right to vote green, vote green. Or if you think it's right not to bother voting at all, which you can give an argument for, do that. But do just what you think contributes best to developing some potential electoral alternative if there ever is one. If you're in a swing state, where your vote's going to matter, well, then you have a real choice. Do you want to vote for Bush? Well, okay. If you want the most reactionary and dangerous force in the world to be in power, then don't vote for Kerry. But that's your choice. There's no point dreaming. If we have failed to create democratic alternatives, because we didn't do the work that was required, then the day the election comes up, you can't pretend that you did it. You didn't do it. Okay, so therefore you're stuck with the choice of voting Bush in or not voting Bush in. And voting for anyone but Kerry happens to be voting Bush in. And the reason is our failure to create an alternative. And I think that was the right decision in 2000 and in 2004, and sometimes in the past. There were some differences, and there may be small differences, but in a huge system of power, small differences can translate into huge effects on people's lives, even on human survival. So I don't think anything wrong with it.
I'm Marianne Grady Flores. I'm the sister of Claire and Teresa Grady from the St. Patrick's Four. I wanted to ask you, Professor Chomsky, if you could address the issue for the need for more civil disobedience and the role that played during the Vietnam War era, and what do we need to do today, the sacrifices that we need to make today, not only on the campuses, but as private citizens, in terms of not paying for war, not pursuing jobs that are going to feed into this system.
Well, I think civil disobedience is very important. In the 60s, I was very much involved in it. So I was one of the two organizers of national tax resistance in 1965. I was very much involved in forming the major resistance support groups, the ones that came to trial in 1968. I was facing a potential long prison sentence myself, called off by the Tet Offensive. It's the only reason it didn't go through. The government after that called off the trials. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but it's a tactic. It's not a principle. And tactics have to be, tactical decisions are very important. They are the ones that have direct human consequences. So they're really important. But they have to be understood as tactics, not as principles. And a tactic has to be judged by its likely impact. Okay? That's a tricky judgment, and I would never urge anyone to trust my judgment, which is usually very bad, and yours is probably better. But anyhow, that's how we should face the question. My own personal judgment, for what it's worth, in general, civil disobedience is a useful tactic if it opens people's minds, it gets them to want to do something more than they're already doing. Okay, in that case, it's a good tactic. And I think that's the criterion you have to use to determine whether it's the right tactic to engage in or not. In the 60s at some stage and into the 70s, I thought it was. My own judgment now is there's other tactics that are better. We already have most of the population on our side. Okay, so I think the major problem is just simple ones: education and organizing. Overcome the atomization, overcome the fact that people can't know the important things because they're kept from them. And they're kept from, there's a reason for the imposed atomization. The massive consumerism is part of it. If you can get people isolated and separated from one another, they're going to be totally ineffectual. They may feel completely hopeless, but they're not going to do anything. You can't even have opinions unless you talk to other people about it. That's true in the hard sciences. You go to an MIT graduate course in physics or in my own field or anything, you form your opinions about technical topics by interacting with others. You don't sit somewhere by yourself and make it all up. You try them, you see how people react, you get some ideas, you change them and so on. If people are, that was the enormous importance of unions and the reason why there's such a huge attack against unions. Unions are a democratizing force. They bring people together and they enable them jointly to do things that none of them can do individually. They're not General Electric. In fact, for the rich, there are plenty of associations. They don't atomize each other. They got all kinds of associations, Business Roundtable, a million others. But they want everybody else to be isolated and separated. That's natural. typical relation between power centers and victims. And it seems to me the major problem is overcoming that. And I'm not sure that civil disobedience is the way to overcome that. Maybe. You've got to make your own judgment. But if it is, it's only if it's supported by other efforts. The efforts to use the civil disobedience as an educational and organizing tool. And then at some point, maybe the civil disobedience does contribute to it. But, without expressing a judgment, because my judgments don't mean anything, and you got to make your own, it seems to me at least those are the criteria we should have in mind. And I think the fundamental problems that face society now are a huge democratic deficit which can be overcome. It's been overcome in the past. It's done in other countries in much harder conditions than ours. There's no reason why we can't do it. However, there is a reason why I'm afraid I have to stop. I was given an order that we're supposed to end at 9 o'clock. I see it passed. So.